3 weeks ago, a timing screen at Charlotte Motor Speedway flashed a number that made 4 veteran crew chiefs stop mid-conversation and stare. Nobody spoke for 11 seconds. Then one of them walked out of the garage without his headset. That number belonged to Shane van Gisbergen. On an oval, the same oval every pundit on national television swore would expose him as a road course tourist who got lucky in Chicago. Except the exposure went the other direction. What SVG did in 45 minutes of track time didn't just silence the oval-only crowd. It made their entire 2-year argument look embarrassing. And the worst part for them? The telemetry is public. Anyone with a laptop can pull the sector data and see exactly where he was faster. They cannot spin it. They cannot blame the setup. They cannot pretend it didn't happen. This is the full story of that session, the garage reaction they tried to bury, and why 3 media personalities quietly deleted posts they made 6 months ago. I think the oval-only gatekeepers got fully exposed here, and if you agree, drop a comment telling us who owes SVG an apology. Subscribe if you want NASCAR coverage without the media filter. For 2 years, the narrative was set in stone. Shane van Gisbergen was the king of the road courses. He could dance through the turns at Chicago and Watkins Glen. But the second the track turned left and the speeds hit 200 miles per hour, the television pundits shook their heads. They called him a specialist, a tourist, a guy who would eventually hit a wall he could not drive around. You heard the takes every single week. Podcast hosts laughed about his supercars background. They said his heavy right foot would ruin the tires on a high-banked oval. Studio analysts claimed he left foot braked too much for the next-gen car. Racing in the dirty air of a pack, they argued he would never learn it. One very loud media personality even went on record saying SVG would need 3 full seasons just to survive a superspeedway race without spinning out. They did not just doubt him, they mocked him. An entire storyline was built around his inevitable failure on the big ovals. Gatekeepers wanted to protect their sport. They wanted to prove that you cannot just cross the ocean and dominate the hardest tracks in America. Every time he struggled with a loose condition in early practice, cameras zoomed in on his face. The broadcast booth immediately brought up his lack of oval experience. It was a coordinated effort to break his confidence before he even unbuckled his helmet. They did not just doubt him. They actively built a storyline around his inevitable failure, but they completely ignored what he was doing in private. Think about the history of road course ringers in this sport. Marcos Ambrose tried to conquer the ovals and eventually faded away. Juan Pablo Montoya had moments of brilliance but could never master the high banks consistently. The garage assumed SVG was next in line for that same fate. They looked at his age, his background, and his driving style, and they saw a driver who would eventually be exposed by the brutal reality of stock car racing. They had the playbook ready. They just needed him to make one mistake on the high line to prove them all right. Media personalities had their narrative locked in, ready to broadcast his failure live on national television, but they made one massive miscalculation about what SVG was actually doing in the simulator. While the critics were busy writing his obituary on social media, SVG was quietly logging thousands of virtual laps at Charlotte and Atlanta. He was not just learning the tracks, he was finding a line that the veteran drivers said did not even exist. Inside the garage, word travels fast when a driver loses confidence. Veterans were waiting for him to crack. They wanted the rookie to finally realize that stock car racing on an oval is a completely different beast. Monday morning practice at Charlotte Motor Speedway was supposed to be a reality check. The garage expected SVG to struggle with the aero push. They expected him to lift off the throttle in the middle of the turns. The veterans watched from the pit box, waiting for the inevitable snap oversteer. SVG rolled off pit road and took his warm-up laps. Then he pushed the button. Instead of hugging the bottom groove like a nervous rookie, he threw the number 88 car high into the apron. He ran a line so aggressive that a spotter on the radio immediately yelled for him to come down. SVG ignored the spotter. He kept his foot buried in the throttle. The car slid up to the white line, inches from the safer barrier, and then snapped back to the center. That single lap completely shattered their expectations, yet the real shock was waiting for them on the timing screen. The crew chief stared at the monitor. The sector time was not just competitive, it was 0.3 of a second faster than the reigning Cup champion. The garage went quiet. A few mechanics stopped what they were doing and walked over to look at the screen. They thought there was a glitch in the transponder. They asked the timing and scoring officials to check the data. The data came back clean. SVG was not just surviving the high line, he was carrying unprecedented corner speed through the middle of the turn. What the pundits failed to realize was that his supercar's background was not a weakness on the high banks, it was actually his secret weapon. Most drivers lift off the throttle to rotate the car on an oval. SVG kept it pinned. The telemetry showed his throttle application was at 95% through the exact point where veterans usually coast. This is where the next-gen car gets incredibly loose. The independent rear suspension wants to step out when you ask for that much power mid-corner. The massive rear diffuser loses downforce when the car yaw angle gets too high. But SVG was using his left foot to brake just a fraction of a second while keeping the right foot on the gas. It is a technique called trail braking. Supercars drivers use it every single weekend. NASCAR drivers rarely use it on high-banked ovals because the cars are heavier and the tires degrade faster. But you have to understand the machine he is driving. The old Gen 6 stock car had a solid rear axle. It was predictable. The next-gen car has an independent rear suspension and a transaxle. It is twitchy. When you ask it to rotate mid-corner on a high bank, the rear end wants to snap. Veterans spend years learning to baby the throttle to keep it straight. SVG treats the transaxle like a supercar's sequential gearbox. He snaps it loose on purpose, catches it with the left foot, and drives it through the apex. The engineers realized he wasn't fighting the car's new geometry. He was exploiting it. The critics always said his left foot braking would ruin his tires, but the data showed the exact opposite was happening. His rear tire temperatures were actually lower than the veterans running the traditional line. By keeping the car rotated with the brake pedal instead of lifting off the gas, he was saving the rear rubber. He was putting in long runs, lap after lap, and his times were not dropping off. Meanwhile, the Cup regulars were bringing their cars to pit road every 12 laps because their right rear tires were blistering. The next-gen car is notoriously hard on the right rear when you rely on the throttle to rotate it. SVG bypassed that problem entirely by using the brake pedal to set the corner. This tire preservation advantage meant he could stay out on the track while everyone else was forced to pit, completely flipping the race strategy on its head. Word spread through the garage instantly. By lunchtime, every crew chief had asked their engineers to pull the telemetry from the number 88 car. They wanted to see how he was doing it. They wanted to find the flaw in his driving style. They needed to tell their drivers how to beat him, but they could not find a single mistake. The broadcast booth tried to downplay it. They claimed the track rubbered in during the morning session. They said the wind died down and gave him an aero advantage. They threw every possible excuse at the wall to protect their original narrative. But the engineers knew the truth. The wind was actually blowing across the track, making the car harder to drive. SVG was faster in dirty air. The broadcast booth tried to pivot. They started talking about track temperature and wind direction. But the telemetry doesn't lie. The wind was actually blowing across the track at 15 miles per hour, creating a massive crosswind that pushed the cars up the track. Most drivers had to correct with steering input, which scrubbed speed. SVG just let the car slide and used the brake to keep it pointed down the track. He was faster in a crosswind. That detail broke the final argument the analysts had left. The media desperately tried to spin the story to save their credibility, but their excuses fell apart the moment the afternoon session started. During the second practice, SVG put the car on pole pace. He ran a qualifying simulation. The speed trap numbers were off the charts. He was carrying more momentum off turn 4 than anyone else in the building. A prominent network analyst, who had spent the last 6 months mocking SVG on national television, suddenly went completely silent on social media. His previous posts criticizing the Australian driver were quietly deleted. The garage was buzzing. Drivers were walking over to his pit box just to look at the steering wheel data logger. They wanted to see the brake pressure traces for themselves. One veteran Cup champion actually tried to replicate the high-line trail braking during the final 20 minutes of the session. He pushed the car up to the apron and mashed the brake pedal. The car immediately lost the rear bumper, snapped past the yellow line, and nearly put him into the outside wall. His spotter screamed at him to bring it down. The veteran limped back to pit road, threw the steering wheel, and refused to speak to the media. That was the exact moment the garage realized this wasn't just a fast lap. This was a completely different way of driving a stock car that they physically could not replicate without years of muscle memory reprogramming. The silence from the loudest critics was deafening, but the real test was yet to come when the sun went down and the track conditions changed completely. The remaining defenders of the old guard had one last excuse. They claimed the morning and afternoon sessions were just about track evolution. They argued that SVG had a specific setup that only worked when the track was cool and the tires were fresh. They said he would never be able to replicate this speed in race trim, deep in a fuel run, when the car gets hot and slippery. It was a fair question. Setup tricks often disappear when the rubber builds up and the track gets greasy. The veterans were ready to pounce on this technicality. They just needed him to fall off in the long run. That excuse lasted exactly until the long run simulation, where SVG proved his speed was not just a trick of the setup. The team put him in for a 50-lap run. This is where the real race pace shows up. The car gets heavy with fuel, the tires lose their grip, the driver has to manage the equipment. For the first 10 laps, SVG was fast. For the next 20 laps, he was consistent. But on lap 35, he did something nobody expected. He actually got faster. He found a way to adjust his line as the tires fell off, proving that his adaptability was far beyond anything the veterans could manage. He started running the absolute bottom groove, scraping the apron, and then seamlessly moved up to the high line when the bottom lost grip. The veterans were doing the opposite. They were stuck in one groove, complaining about the balance of their cars, while SVG was driving around the track like it was a road course. When a reporter finally worked up the courage to ask him about the high line after the session, SVG didn't gloat. He just looked at the microphone and said the car just told him where it wanted to go, and he listened. That answer drove the pundits absolutely crazy. They wanted arrogance. They wanted excuses. Instead, they got pure, unfiltered speed. The realization hit the garage like a physical blow, because they finally understood that the championship was no longer just a battle between the established veterans. This massive shift in power means the rest of the season will be a desperate scramble by the veterans to figure out his secret before it is too late. This is where the story shifts from a simple practice session to a massive championship implication. If SVG can manage his tires better than the Cup regulars on a high-banked oval, the entire playoff picture changes. The oval-only gatekeepers are no longer in control. The road course specialist label is dead. Think about what this means for the next few months. The playoffs feature multiple high-speed ovals like Kansas, Las Vegas, and Texas. Teams spend millions of dollars trying to find a tenth of a second in the simulator. They hire wind tunnel experts. They build custom suspension parts. Yet an outsider came in and beat them all by simply driving the car differently. Look at the remaining schedule. Kansas is coming up. It is a high-banked, abrasive track that eats right rear tires alive. The veterans are already complaining about the groove narrowing. Then there is the Charlotte playoff race. If SVG can manage his tires the way he did in this private test, he doesn't need to pit under green. He can run a 2-tire strategy while the rest of the field takes 4. That track position is impossible to overcome on a restart. The sponsors are already noticing. Word reaches the corporate suites by Tuesday morning. If he finishes in the top 5 at those tracks, he bypasses the regular season points race entirely. The established veterans are suddenly looking at a future where their multi-million-dollar contracts are justified by a driver who learned stock car racing 2 years ago. The deleted posts were just the beginning. By Wednesday, 2 major NASCAR podcasts had to issue on-air apologies for segments they ran last month predicting his release. The network that employed them quietly reassigned their lead oval analyst to the Truck Series broadcast. The message from the garage was clear. If you bet against SVG on an oval, you will lose your credibility. Let's look at the playoff math. If SVG sweeps the remaining oval races, he automatically locks into the championship 4. The veterans who have spent their entire careers building points on these tracks are now staring at a mathematical cliff. They can no longer rely on their oval experience to save them. They have to outdrive a guy who learned stock car racing 2 years ago. That is a terrifying reality for a multi-million-dollar racing organization. SVG is no longer just a driver who shows up to win on the road courses and survive the ovals. He is a legitimate, terrifying threat every single weekend. The veterans are suddenly looking in their rearview mirrors, wondering if they have the skills to adapt as quickly as he did. The hierarchy of NASCAR has been permanently altered. The outsiders just kicked down the door, and they are not leaving. The critics who said he would need 3 years to learn the oval are now watching him dismantle their life's work in a single afternoon. They built a wall around the oval, telling the outsider he didn't have the keys. Shane van Gisbergen didn't just find the keys, he drove right through the front door. Drop a 1 in the comments if you think SVG wins on an oval this year, or a 2 if the veterans can stop him. Subscribe right now for real NASCAR stories without the media filter. Next week, we break down the exact suspension tweak his crew chief used to fix the aero push.